Chapter 3 A Lady's Handbag. Friday, June 14, 9:30 a.m. The district attorney and Heath walked up to the body and stood regarding it. "You see," Heath explained, "he was shot directly from the front. Pretty powerful shot, too, for the bullet passed through the head and struck the woodwork over there by the window." He pointed to a place on the wainscot a short distance from the floor near the drapery of the window nearest the hallway. "We found the expelled shell, and Captain Hagedorn's got the bullet." He turned to the firearms expert. "How about it, Captain? Anything special?" Hagedorn raised his head slowly and gave Heath a myopic frown. Then, after a few awkward movements, he answered with unhurried precision. "A .45 Army bullet, Colt automatic." "Any idea how close to Benson the gun was held?" asked Markham. "Yes, sir, I have," Hagedorn replied, in his ponderous monotone. "Between 5 and 6 feet, probably." Heath snorted. "Probably," he repeated to Markham with good-natured contempt. "You can bank on it if the captain says so. You see, sir, nothing smaller than a .44 or .45 will stop a man. And these steel-capped army bullets go through a human skull like it was cheese. But in order to carry straight to the woodwork, the gun had to be held pretty close. And as there aren't any powder marks on the face, it's a safe bet to take the captain's figures as to distance." At this point, we heard the front door open and close, and Dr. Doremus, the chief medical examiner, accompanied by his assistant, bustled in. He shook hands with Markham and Inspector O'Brien and gave Heath a friendly salutation. "Sorry I couldn't get here sooner," he apologized. He was a nervous man with a heavily seamed face and the manner of a real estate salesman. "What have we got here?" he asked, in the same breath, making a wry face at the body in the chair. "You tell us, Doc," retorted Heath. Dr. Doremus approached the murdered man with a callous indifference indicative of a long process of hardening. He first inspected the face closely. He was, I imagine, looking for powder marks. Then he glanced at the bullet hole in the forehead and at the ragged wound in the back of the head. Next he moved the dead man's arms, bent the fingers, and pushed the head a little to the side. Having satisfied himself as to the state of rigor mortis, he turned to Heath. "Can we get him on the settee there?" Heath looked at Markham inquiringly. "All through, sir?" Markham nodded, and Heath beckoned to the two men at the front windows and ordered the body placed on the davenport. It retained its sitting posture due to the hardening of the muscles after death, until the doctor and his assistant straightened out the limbs. The body was then undressed, and Dr. Doremus examined it carefully for other wounds. He paid particular attention to the arms, and he opened both hands wide and scrutinized the palms. At length he straightened up and wiped his hands on a large colored silk handkerchief. "Shot through the left frontal," he announced. "Direct angle of fire. Bullet passed completely through the skull. Exit wound in the left occipital region, base of the skull. You found the bullet, didn't you?" "He was awake when shot, and death was immediate. Probably never knew what hit him. He's been dead about, well, I should judge, 8 hours, maybe longer." "How about 12:30 for the exact time?" asked Heath. Doctor looked at his watch. "Fit's okay. Anything else?" No one answered, and after a slight pause, the chief inspector spoke. "We'd like a post-mortem report today, Doctor." "That'll be all right," Dr. Dormus answered, snapping shut his medical case and handing it to his assistant. "But get the body to the mortuary as soon as you can." After a brief handshake ceremony, he went out hurriedly. Heath turned to the detective who had been standing by the table when we entered. "Burke, you phone headquarters to call for the body, and tell them to get a move on. Then go back to the office and wait for me." Burke saluted and disappeared. Heath then addressed one of the two men who had been inspecting the grills of the front windows. "How about that ironwork, Snitkin?" "No chance, Sergeant," was the answer. Strong as a jail, both of them. "Nobody never got in through those windows." "Very good," Heath told them. "Now you two fellows chase along with Burke." When they had gone, the dapper man in the blue serge suit and derby, whose fear of activity had seemed to be the fireplace, laid 2 cigarette butts on the table. "I found these under the gas log, Sergeant," he explained enthusiastically. "Not much, but there's nothing else laying around." "All right, Emery." Heath gave the butts a disgruntled look. "You needn't wait either. I'll see you at the office later." Hagedorn came ponderously forward. "I guess I'll be getting along too," he rumbled. "But I'm going to keep this bullet a while. It's got some peculiar rifling marks on it. You don't want especially, do you, Sergeant? Heath smiled tolerantly. What'll I do with it, Captain? You keep it. But don't you dare lose it. I won't lose it, Hagedorn assured him, with stodgy seriousness. And, without so much as a glance at either the district attorney or the chief inspector, he waddled from the room with a slightly rolling movement which suggested that of some huge amphibious mammal. Vance, who was standing beside me near the door, turned and followed Hagedorn into the hall. The two stood talking in low tones for several minutes. Vance appeared to be asking questions, and although I was not close enough to hear their conversation, I caught several words and phrases: trajectory, muzzle velocity, angle of fire, impetus, impact, deflection, and the like, and wondered what on earth had prompted this strange interrogation. As Vance was thanking Hagedorn for his information, Inspector O'Brien entered the hall. "Learning fast?" he asked, smiling patronizingly at Vance. Then, without waiting for a reply, "Come along, Captain. I'll drive you downtown." Markham heard him. "Have you got room for Dinwiddie too, Inspector?" "Plenty, Mr. Markham." The three of them went out. Vance and I now were left alone in the room with Heath and the district attorney, and, as if by common impulse, we all settled ourselves in chairs, Vance taking one near the dining room door directly facing the chair in which Benson had been murdered. I had been keenly interested in Vance's manner and actions from the moment of his arrival at the house. When he had first entered the room he had adjusted his monocle carefully, an act which, despite his air of passivity, I recognized as an indication of interest. When his mind was alert and he wished to take on external impressions quickly, he invariably brought out his monocle. He could see adequately enough without it, and his use of it, I had observed, was largely the result of an intellectual dictate. The added clarity of vision it gave him seemed subtly to affect his clarity of mind. At first he had looked over the room incuriously and watched the proceedings with bored apathy, but during Heath's brief questioning of his subordinates, an expression of cynical amusement had appeared on his face. Following a few general queries to Assistant District Attorney Dinwiddie, he had sauntered, with apparent aimlessness, about the room, looking at the various articles and occasionally shifting his gaze back and forth between different pieces of furniture. At length he had stooped down and inspected the mark made by the bullet on the wainscot, and once he had gone to the door and looked up and down the hall. The only thing that he seemed to hold his attention to any extent was the body itself. He had stood before it for several minutes, studying its position, and had even bent over the outstretched arm on the table as if just to see how the dead man's hand was holding the book. The cross position of the legs, however, had attracted him most, and he had stood studying them for a considerable time. Finally, he had returned his monocle to his waistcoat pocket, and joined Dinwiddie and me near the door, where he had stood, watching Heath and the other detectives with lazy indifference until the departure of Captain Hagedorn. The four of us had no more than taken seats when the patrolman stationed in the vestibule appeared at the door. "There's a man from the local precinct stationed here, sir," he announced, "who wants to see the officer in charge. Shall I send him in?" Heath nodded curtly, and a moment later a large, red-faced Irishman in civilian clothes stood before us. He saluted Heath, but on recognizing the district attorney, made Markham the recipient of his report. "I'm Officer McLaughlin, sir, West 47th Street Station," he informed us, "and I was on duty on this beat last night. Around midnight, I guess it was, there was a big gray Cadillac standing in front of this house. I noticed it particular because it had a lot of fishing tackle sticking out the back, and all of its lights were on. When I heard of the crime this morning, I reported the car to the station sergeant, and he sent me around to tell you about it." "Excellent," Markham commented, and then, with a nod, referred the matter to Heath. "Maybe something in it," the latter admitted dubiously. "How long would you say the car was here, officer?" "A good half hour, anyway. It was here before 12, and when I come back at 12:30 or thereabouts, it was still here. But the next time I come by, it was gone." "You saw nothing else? Nobody in the car, or anyone hanging around who might have been the owner?" "No, sir, I did not." Several other questions of a similar nature were asked him, but nothing more could be learned, and he was dismissed. "Anyway," remarked Heath, "the car story will be good stuff to hand the reporters." Vance had sat through the questioning of McLaughlin with drowsy inattention, I doubt if he even heard more than the first few words of the officer's report. And now, with a stifled yawn, he rose and sauntered to the center table, picked up one of the cigarette butts that had been found in the fireplace. After rolling it between his thumb and forefinger and scrutinizing the tip, he ripped the paper open with his thumbnail and held the exposed tobacco to his nose. Heath, who had been watching him glowingly, leaned suddenly forward in his chair. "What are you doing there?" he demanded. In a tone of surly truculence, Vance lifted his eyes in decorous astonishment. "Merely smelling of the tobacco," he replied, with condescending unconcern. "It's rather mild, you know, but delicately blended." The muscles in Heath's cheeks worked angrily. "Well, you'd better put it down, sir," he advised. Then he looked Vance up and down. "Tobacco expert?" he asked, with ill-disguised sarcasm. "Oh dear no." Vance's voice was dulcet. "My specialty is scarab cartridges of the Ptolemaic dynasties." Markham interposed diplomatically. "You really shouldn't touch anything around here, Vance, at this stage of the game. You never know what'll turn out to be important. Those cigarette stubs may quite possibly be significant evidence." "Evidence?" repeated Vance sweetly. "My word, you don't say, really. Most amusing." Markham was plainly annoyed, and Heath was boiling inward, but made no further comment. He even forced a mirthless smile. He evidently felt that he had been a little too abrupt with his friend of the district attorney's, however much the friend might have deserved being reprimanded. Heath, however, was no sycophant in the presence of his superiors. He knew his worth and lived up to it with his whole energy, discharging the task to which he was assigned with a dogged indifference to his own political well-being. This stubbornness of spirit and the solidity of character it implied were respected and valued by the men over him. He was a large, powerful man, but agile and graceful in his movements, like a highly trained boxer. He had hard, blue eyes, remarkably bright and penetrating, a small nose, a broad oval chin, and a stern, straight mouth with lips that appeared almost compressed. His hair, which, though he was well along in his 40s, was without a trace of grayness, was cropped about the edges, and stood upright in a short, bristly pompadour. His voice had an aggressive resonance, but he rarely blustered. In many ways he accorded with the conventional notion of what a detective is like. But there was something more to the man's personality, an added capability and strength, as it were, and as I sat watching him that morning, I felt myself unconsciously admiring him, despite his very obvious limitations. "What's the exact situation, Sergeant?" Markham asked. Dinwiddie gave me only the barest facts. Heath cleared his throat. "We got the word a little before 7. Benson's housekeeper, a Mrs. Platts, called up the local station and reported that she found him dead, and asked that someone be sent over at once. The message, of course, was relayed to headquarters. I wasn't there at the time, but Burke and Emery were on duty, and after notifying Inspector Moran, they came on up here. Several of the men from the local station were already on the job doing the usual nosing about. When the inspector had got here and looked the situation over, he telephoned me to hurry along. When I arrived, the local men had gone, and 3 more men from the Homicide Bureau had joined Burke and Emery. The inspector also phoned Captain Hagedorn. He thought the case big enough to call him in on it at once, and the captain had just got here when you arrived. Mr. Dinwiddie had come right after the inspector and phoned you at once. Chief Inspector O'Brien came along a little ahead of me. I questioned the Platts woman right off, and my men were looking the place over when you showed up." "Where is this Mrs. Platts now?" asked Markham. "Upstairs, being watched by one of the local men. She lives in the house." "Why did you mention the specific hour of 12:30 to the doctor?" "Platts told me she heard a report at that time, which I thought might have been the shot. I guess now it was the shot. It checks up with a number of things." "I think we'd better have another talk with Mrs. Platts," Markham suggested. "But first, did you find anything suggestive in the room here? Anything to go on?" Heath hesitated almost imperceptibly. Then he drew from his coat pocket a woman's handbag and a pair of long white kid gloves, and tossed them on the table in front of the district attorney. "Only these," he said. "One of the local men found them on the end of the mantel over there." After a casual inspection of the gloves, Markham opened the handbag and turned its contents out on the table. I came forward and looked on, but Vance remained in his chair, placidly smoking a cigarette. The handbag was of a fine gold mesh with a catch set with small sapphires. It was unusually small, and obviously designed only for evening wear. The objects which it had held, and which Markham was now inspecting, consisted of a flat water silk cigarette case, a small gold phial of Roger and Gallet's Fleurs d'Amour perfume, a cloisonné vanity compact, a short delicate cigarette holder of inlaid amber, a gold case lipstick, a small embroidered French linen handkerchief with MSTC monogrammed in the corner, and a Yale latchkey. "This ought to give us a good lead," said Markham, indicating the handkerchief. "I suppose you went over the articles carefully, Sergeant?" Heath nodded. "Yes, and I imagine the bag belongs to the woman Benson was out with last night. The housekeeper told me he had an appointment and went out to dinner in his dress clothes. She didn't hear Benson when he came back, though. Anyway, we ought to be able to run down Miss MSTC without much trouble." Markham had taken up the cigarette case again, and as she held it upside down, a little shower of loose dried tobacco fell out on the table. Heath stood up suddenly. "Maybe those cigarettes came out of that case," he suggested. He picked up the intact butt and looked at it. "It's a lady's cigarette, all right. It looks as though it might have been smoked in a holder, too." "I beg to differ with you, Sergeant," drawled Vance. "You'll forgive me, I'm sure, but there's a bit of lip rouge on the end of the cigarette. It's hard to see on account of the gold tip." Heath looked at Vance sharply. He was too much surprised to be resentful. After a closer inspection of the cigarette, he turned again to Vance. "Perhaps you could tell us from these tobacco grains if the cigarettes came out from this case," he suggested with gruff irony. "One never knows, does one?" Vance replied, indolently rising. Picking up the case, he pressed it wide open and tapped it on the table. Then he looked into it closely, and a humorous smile twitched the corners of his mouth. Putting his forefinger deep into the case, he drew out a small cigarette which had evidently been wedged flat along the bottom of the pocket. "My olfactory gifts won't be necessary now," he said. "It is apparent even to the naked eye that the cigarettes are, to speak loosely, identical." "Eh, what, Sergeant?" Heath grinned good-naturedly. "That's one on us, Mr. Markham." And he carefully put the cigarette and the stub in an envelope, which he marked and pocketed. "You now see, Vance," observed Markham, "the importance of those cigarette butts." "Can't say that I do," responded the other. "Of what possible value is a cigarette butt? You can't smoke it, you know." "It's evidence, my dear fellow," explained Markham patiently. "One knows that the owner of this bag returned with Benson last night and remained long enough to smoke 2 cigarettes. Vance lifted his eyebrows in mock amazement. "One does one? Fancy that now." "It only remains to locate her," interjected Heath. "She's a rather decided brunette. At any rate, if that fact will facilitate your quest any," said Vance easily. "Though why you should desire to annoy the lady, I can't for the life of me imagine. Really I can't, don't you know?" "Why do you say she's a brunette?" asked Markham. "Well, if she isn't," Vance told him, sinking listlessly back in his chair, "then she should consult a cosmetician as to the proper way to make up. I see she uses Rachel powder and Guerlain's dark lipstick, and it simply isn't done among blondes, old dear." "I defer, of course, to your expert opinion," smiled Markham. Then to Heath, "I guess we'll have a look for a brunette, Sergeant." "It's all right with me," agreed Heath jocularly. By this time, I think he had entirely forgiven Vance for destroying the cigarette butt.